Hi all, in this lecture we'll be talking about the bonds. We already discussed in the last lecture that the skeleton system is divided into two parts, that is the egg cell skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. Egg cell skeleton consists of the bones of the head, neck and trunk. The appendicular skeleton consists of the bones of the limbs including those forming the pectoral and the pelvic girdle. Our skeleton is composed of cartilages and bones. Cartilages are semi-rigid connective tissue and bones are highly specialized calcified connective tissues. Cartilage is present in the parts of the skeleton where more flexibility is required. Then the proportion of bone and cartilage in the skeleton changes as we grow. Younger the person is more cartilage he or she has in the body. The bones of a newborn are very soft and it is flexible because they are mostly composed of cartilage. Bones perform so many functions in our body. It is the chief supporting tissue of the body and provide protection for vital structures, for example, the heart and brain. It also produces movements. It stores minerals like calcium and phosphorus and store fats. Also, bones produces blood cells in the bone marrow. Let's talk about the type of bones. We have two types of bones, combat bone and spongy bone. Spongy bone is otherwise called the trabecular bone. So in this picture you can see combat bone and spongy bone. Combat bone is the outer bone and it is rigid. Spongy bone is the inner bone and it is porous. So they are distinguished by the relative amount of solid matter and by the number and size of the space they contain. The combat bones, they have more solid matter than the spongy bones. Well, the spongy bones, it has more space than the space in between than the combat bones. So all bones that have a superficial thin layer of combat bone around a central mass of spongy bone. The architecture and the proportion of combat and spongy bones vary according to the function. The combat bone, it provides strength for weight bearing, and the spongy bone, it reduces the density of the bone. Bone are calcified tissue which has a thin layer of compact bone surrounding spongy bone. The soft tissue present inside the bone is called bone marrow, where the blood cells are formed. It also serves as a reservoir for calcium and phosphorus and also produce movement which is permitted by joints. So they are classified according to shape into long, short, flat, irregular and sesamoid bone. And according to their developmental history, they are again classified into endochondral and membranous bones. Let's talk about the long bones. Long bones include the humerus with radius, ulna, femur, tibia, fibula, metacarpal and the phalanges. These are formed by the replacement of the hyaline cartilage plate through the endochondral ossification, which we will discuss later in this lecture. Okay, next is the short bones. Short bones are cuboidal in shape. They include the carpal and the tarsal bones. Short bones are composed of spongy bone and marrow surrounded by a thin layer of combat bones. Next is the flat bones. Flat bones includes the ribs, sternum, scapula and bones in the vault of the skull. So the main function of flat bone is they will protect the organs. For example, the cranium protecting the cranial bones protecting the brain. Then they have two layers of combat bones, enclosing the spongy bone and the marrow. Next one is the irregular bonds. Irregular bonds are bonds of mixed shape, such as the bonds of the skull, the vertebrae, bonds of the face, then sacrum and coccyx. So they contains mostly spongy bonds, which is enveloped by a thin layer of combat bonds. The last classification is the sesamoid bond. Sesamoid bond develop in certain tendons and they reduce the friction on the tendon. So example of sesamoid bond is the patella or the kneecap. We have two ways to build bone in our body. The first is the intermembranous ossification and second is the endochondral ossification. In intermembranous ossification, bone is formed from a membrane, and in endochondral ossification, bone is formed from the cartilage. Let's talk about intermembranous ossification. So our bone will form from dense irregular connective tissue membrane. Intermembranous ossification will happen in flat bones, especially the bones in the skull. At 8th week of gestation, the dense irregular connective tissue, it has mesenchymal cells in there, and this mesenchymal cells is differentiates into osteoblast. This process, it happens in an ossification center. So then the osteoblast, it starts making the bone matrix or the bone tissue. Eventually they will start making the spongy bone. So the osteoblast which is present in the spongy bone, they keep building bone, and the spongy bone, it will turn into combat bone. So this combat bone is covered by a dense irregular connective tissue which is called the periosteum, and this periosteum, it functions as a protective sheath for the bone, and also it helps in building and growing bone through the process of intermembranous ossification. Next is endochondral ossification. Chondro means cartilage and ossification means bone formation. So endochondral ossification, it starts with the hyaline cartilage model. All our long bones like humerus, the radius, ulna, etc. forms through this process. So hyaline cartilage has cartilaginous cells in it, and these cartilaginous cells are called the chondrocytes. And also hyaline cartilage model, it has a protective sheath around it, and that is called the perichondrium. So perichondrium covers almost all type of cartilages. It is a protective sheath for cartilage. The structure that surrounds bone tissue, it is called the periosteum. The mesenchymal stem cells, there are a lot of mesenchymal stem cells in the perichondrium, and the mesenchymal stem cells living in the perichondrium, they will differentiate into osteoblast. So what is the function of osteoblast? Osteoblast will produce bone tissue. So it produces the bone tissue and forms a bony collar surrounding the hyaline cartilage model. So we have chondrocytic cells present inside the hyaline cartilage, right? As a bony collar it forms, this is going to cut the nutrient supply of the hyaline cartilage model. So, and the cells which is present inside the hyaline cartilage, they will start to die because they are not getting nutrients. So this is going to create a calcified cartilage matrix inside the hyaline cartilage. Now the blood vessels which are present outside of the hyaline cartilage start to supply them the nutrients. So now the osteoclast and the osteoblast which is present in the perichondrium, they will become activate, and the osteoclast, it will start degrading the cartilage matrix. So which is going to create a lot of space inside the hyaline cartilage model, and that space is called the medullary cavity. Now the osteoblast, it will start making bones. So now the bone tissue will replace the cartilage, except in the epiphyseal plate. We will still have hyaline cartilage in the epiphyseal plate. So this allows the length of your long bones. So that's the process of endochondral ossification.